Everyone. My name is David Gallo. I'm the director of the AIFC Academy of Law. And on behalf of the Academy, I'd like to welcome all of you to today's event. Today is a particularly exciting day because our topic is highly relevant and highly practical. And it is an extraordinarily set of concepts that will be discussed today by our distinguished speakers. So the title of today's event is A Global and Local Approach to Business Ethics. And this program is being brought to you on a pro bono complimentary basis as part of the webinar series that the Academy of Law has been hosting. These are fundamentally 1-hour formats with distinguished experts in their field. And today is certainly no exception. So the webinar is going to cover several topics, and the speakers will obviously get into more detail on this. But first is going to be, what are business ethics? What are the benefits of ethics programs? And what is the importance of values-based programs? What are some of the lessons learned here at the AIFC? And then what about some evolving gray areas of ethics? All of those things will be covered. The format will be this. We'll go through the presentations of the speakers. And during the event itself, my colleague Almas will be prompting you to send in any written questions that you have on the chat function. And you can raise your hand if you would like to ask a direct question to the speaker, but we will save Q&A until we get toward the end of the program, at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to send in your chats or raise your hand at the end. Let me introduce today's speakers. I'll introduce both of them, and then I'll turn the floor over to them both. First, we have Ms. Philippa Foster-Beck. Philippa has 30 years of business experience, having begun her career at Citibank. She then took on several very senior group finance director and group treasurer functions at various organizations. And she was appointed director of the Institute of Business Ethics in 2001. She stepped down in April 2020, so she had a very distinguished career at the Institute of Business Ethics. And in 2020, she was appointed a member of the IBE'S International Advisory Council. Philippa joined the board of the FICC Financial Markets Standards Board in June of 2020. And she sits on the boards of Barrier Biotech Limited, as well as the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment. Our other speaker today is Ms. Zere Seidimbek, who has 20 years of work experience at state-owned entities. She took part in significant governmental initiatives aimed at fostering economic development of Kazakhstan, such as the Cluster Initiative, setting up the National Holding Company, the PPP Center, and setting up the Astana International Financial Center. Zere served as Chief Internal Policy Officer of the AIFC Authority and a non-executive member of the Board of Directors of the Astana Financial Services Authority, which is the financial regulator of the AIFC. In the capacity of the Chief Internal Policy Officer at the AIFC, she headed the team responsible for the development of the AIFC Ethics Code and oversaw the implementation of the ethics program in the AIFC. I truly cannot think of two more qualified individuals who can bring their experience and their professional expertise to this subject of a global and local approach to business ethics. With that, let me turn the floor over to Philippa. Philippa, great to see you again. Welcome and all the best.
Thank you very much indeed, David, for your kind introductory remarks, and good afternoon to everybody. It's a great pleasure and honor to be speaking with you all today. We have about 50 minutes ahead of us, which we will include an opportunity, as you've heard, to ask questions at the end. Any questions that we can't address during the session, we'd be happy to answer by email afterwards. And also the presentation will be sent to you in due course. So first, let's get started with a brief word about the introduction, the Institute of Business Ethics, which you may not have come across before. You've heard a little about my career, and certainly I found when I became director of the Institute that for the first time I was a round peg in a round hole, because as many of you will have discovered, there are many ethical issues you come up against in day-to-day life, and we're going to touch on those, as David said, towards the end of the presentation. But the Institute itself is an educational charity. It's funded by companies, professional service firms, professional service bodies, associations and individuals. And whilst it's based in London, where I am presently, it works internationally, undertaking a range of activities that you can see listed on this slide. And you can also see here a collection of some of the publications, the briefings, and the toolkits that the Institute has put together over the recent years. But the Institute itself seeks to assist organizations to achieve their best. So it doesn't have a one-size-fits-all solution, but we've developed a framework to help those developing an ethics program. This framework demonstrates that ethical values are at the heart of creating a trustworthy organization. Those values inform the purpose, business model, decision-making and governance, all combining to set the tone and culture of the organization. They also inform, as you can see through the downward arrows, a code of ethics. This is itself supported by 4 pillars of sharing it, reinforcing it, monitoring it and assessing it, which when all come together will help create a positive environment to work in, enhancing trust and reputation externally, and if operating in a commercial environment, will feed through to the bottom line, as you can see coming through at the arrows at the bottom of the framework. This framework sort of gives you an overall view, if you like, a global view, which Zere will, in her presentation, bring alive for you at the local and organizational level. But the key, as I've said, is starting with values. So they come first. Here is a pyramid, which I will use to explain the different aspects of how values interact across the piece. The first and most important set of values are those we hold as individuals. We could have a click, please, Zere. Thank you. We may not have ever really thought about these personal values or indeed written them down, but they sit there within us. They may have been nurtured during our upbringing, they might have come from our faith, or been influenced by friends or those that we admire. But we know when they're tested. It's when we feel uncomfortable, sometimes angry, but certainly emotional. A second set of values may be laid down by the professional body that you might be a member of as a lawyer or an accountant. And those values are typically focused on integrity, honesty, and accountability as a professional to those that you're working with. The third set are those set down by the organization or the company that one works for. If these 3 sets of values are not aligned, then tensions and disease may arise, leading to stress and mental anguish. Because to work in an environment where you are made to feel uncomfortable by the behavior of those around you or what you're being asked to do day to day can be very difficult. It's often the stage when people leave. That's particularly if they don't feel able to raise a concern about the culture, which brings in the ability to speak up and raise queries if you're not comfortable about the environment you're working in. But we'll leave that for another day. The fourth set of values, which oversee us all, are societal values. Now, these of course change from time to time as a reaction often to the behavior of individuals, professionals, or companies. This seems to be happening particularly at the moment as with Black Lives Matter that's going global, and other issues in the presently in the public domain, where sort of societal values from the past are being rewritten in today's times. And these do raise lots of ethical issues, as I'm sure you're aware of, but it demonstrates that when these sets of values, and when society changes the values, then through the due process, society introduces new regulations and laws to force change behaviors. And that is, as I said, connected with what some of the societal changes we're seeing at the moment comes through. So this then leads to the IBE's definition of business ethics. The definition used is the application of ethical values to business behavior. It's not rocket science by any means, but it's applying those ethical value words, like those being tweeted by the birds in the cartoon on the slide: respect, integrity, fairness, trust, honesty. It's applying those values to personal conduct and in business decision making that's so important, because it's combined behaviors of everybody in an organization that actually help to shape the culture that the organization hopes to achieve or actually wants. And behavior, of course, is the basis of developing trust. All of us want to prove both personally and professionally and as an organization that we are trustworthy. We have earned people's trust, which is an integral part of the culture within the organization. Some of you may have come across this iceberg picture developed by Torben Rick. The power of this pictorial expression is that, like an iceberg, the majority of the organization's cultural manifestations are not actually visible. They're below the waterline, as it were. So above the waterline, we can read and see how the organization says it operates, the way we say we get things done. Its vision, purpose, strategy, policy, goals, and importantly, the stated hierarchies and organization charts. And this is often all that an external person will see of an organization, looking at their website and perhaps chatting to people they know, or maybe then through the press and through looking at websites like Glassdoor, you might be able to get a feeling of what's really going on, i.e. what is below the waterline. And that is the way that we really get things done, as the picture states. It's the informal structure to the organization. It's things such as going to those you know will actually help you to achieve something, rather than perhaps asking the people you should be asking to help you do something. Working to the informal rather than the formal rules to get things done, and so forth. So instead of going to A to B straight ahead, you might go A to C to B to get the outcome that you want to achieve, because you know by going to A to B, because of the way the organization or the culture of the organization is, you're not going to achieve what you wish to. And all of this sort of informal aspect of the organization is actually built on the relationships that people establish in the organization, the stories that are told to each other, the stories that are inherited, the perceptions, the real values and traditions of the organization which build up over time. They can be negative, of course, but mostly they're usually positive, but they do help to sum up the culture of the organization And that is what all leaders in all organizations actually need to be aware of and understand in understanding the culture of how the organization works. And at that point, I'd like to hand over to Zere, who's going to tell us about introducing the AIFC Code of Ethics.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you at today's webinar and thank you for your interest in it. David, thank you very much for introduction. Philippa, thank you very much for setting the scene and introducing the key terms. In my turn, I would like to give a local perspective on embedding the ethical culture in an organization. I hope that the AIFC experience on implementation of the ethics program will be useful to other companies working in Kazakhstan. The AIFC launched its ethics program more than a year ago. There were a number of reasons for that, and I'd like to highlight just 4 of them. Firstly, we wanted to build trust with our stakeholders. We believe that clear adherence to ethical principles and ethical behaviors will help to build trust with all stakeholders, including investors, AIFC participants, employees, and community. Secondly, it was important to ensure our customers' satisfaction. By customers here, we mean companies registered in the AIFC benefiting from the ecosystem of the AIFC, as well as individuals using services of the AIFC. Ethical principles embedded in our organization will guide employees on how to behave in contentious situations and how to deal with AIFC customers. And we hope that this, as a result, will increase customer satisfaction. Thirdly, we wanted to ensure employee satisfaction. We believe that embedding the ethical behavior within the AIFC will contribute to making it a better employer and to attracting and retaining talented people. And finally, we hope to set the benchmark for our market. Being guided by best practices with regard to ethics, the AIFC could become a benchmark for companies registered in the AIFC and in a wider context for companies working in Kazakhstan. And this is one of the reasons why we actually holding this webinar today. When we launched the ethics program, we understood that the ethics program is not a point in time, or it is not a specific result that we are striving to achieve. But ethics program is rather a journey. It doesn't finish when a specific milestone is achieved. The AIFC started this journey and we approved our ethics code. The code was approved in June 2020. At the same time, we understand that the code is necessary, but it is not sufficient at all. Therefore, we have developed a roadmap for this year, and we envisage a number of actions aimed at implementing the code and embedding our ethical values in our day-to-day behavior. These actions and arrangements include appointment of ethics officer and ethics ambassadors in each AIFC body and organization, training them, holding webinars for the management and other employees. Well, now let me elaborate more about the AIFC ethics code, and then I could share with you lessons we learned during our journey. One of key objectives of any ethics code implemented by any organization is clearly setting out ethical values of that organization. Bearing this in mind, prior to developing the code, we have conducted a survey among all AIFC employees to find out what they consider to be most important. As a result, we have come up with 4 core ethical values, and they are now shown on this slide. So these core values of the AIFC that are set out in the ethics code are: first, accountability, meaning that we take responsibility for all our actions and their consequences. Integrity, meaning that we can be trusted by our partners and stakeholders, and we treat everyone with respect regardless of their nationality, gender, age, etc. Focus on future, meaning we always think one step ahead, or at least try to do so. And finally, collaboration, meaning we value each team member's contribution, and together we build a true AFC family. The AFC Ethics Code is structured around our relations with 4 categories of entities that we deal with, namely our stakeholders. That include local community, our employees, the government, AFC Management Council, AFC participants, etc. It is market, that includes our partners and AFC participants. It is a wider society and our team members. The code specifies and outlines our standards of behavior in relation with each of these categories. And we strive to highest corporate governance standards, and we act honestly, openly, and ethically with all of them. In addition to this, we have a general part of the ethics code, and this part elaborates on issues that are equally applicable to our relations with all 4 categories that I mentioned before. It contains provisions relating to compliance with the law, handling confidential information, reporting and maintaining records, handling conflicts of interest, our approach towards bribery and corruption, communicating and using social media. So this actually gives a brief overview of the contents of the AFC Ethics Code. So we believe that we are in a quite good position, having started like a year ago, and we have results already that we can be proud of, in my opinion. So what we've done is we approved the ethics code and published it on our website. We approved the ethics program action plan, or ethics roadmap as we call it. And we have ethics officer and ethics ambassadors appointed in every AFC body and AFC organization. We are now working on internal policies that should be developed in support of the ethics code. And we have held a number of internal webinars and trainings for ethics ambassadors, for the top and mid management, for employees. We have developed and published guidelines on raising concerns and checklists for decision making for our management. At the same time, as I mentioned, the ethics program is a journey, and we still have a lot to do. We also plan to develop ethics roadmap on an annual basis. One of the important documents to be developed in future is charter on the ethics team. We hope that this charter will be approved, and it will outline the composition and the purpose of the AFC ethics team, its principles, its functions and responsibilities, and will set out requirements to ethics team members. Another important document that to be adopted in the AFC is a speak up policy. Its purpose is to preserve the ethical workplace and encourage employees to share concerns and report violations of the ethics code and the internal policies. The speak up policy will support the non-retaliation policy of the AFC and provide staff with clear instructions on how to raise concerns in good faith. We also envisage developing the ethics code brochure. It will contain explanation of the provisions of the code, examples of ethical dilemmas with detailed instructions on how to behave in certain situations. The AFC has implemented the ethics code based on international best practices. Nevertheless, there were areas where we need to take into account the local specifics or the local approach. Even operating in the common law jurisdiction, the AFC had to take into account the local approach. And I'd like to mention 2 issues in this area. First, locally, it is important to take into account at what level the ASICS code is adopted or who adopts the code. We understand that the documents adopted by an authority of a lower level cannot apply to authorities of a higher level according to the hierarchy. Therefore, the AFC ASICS code was adopted by the AFC governor, and now it is applicable to all AFC bodies and organizations except for the management council, which is actually being the AFC body, but it's a collegial body headed by the president. Second is we notice that many codes of international companies or those that we saw that were adopted in other countries had a very informal style. They contain discussions, examples, and dilemmas. We took a slightly different approach and adopted the code as a legal document to make sure that it is enforceable. Nevertheless, we tried to avoid too legalistic language. And to make the code more user-friendly, we also planned to develop the ASIC brochure that I mentioned before. And I hope that this will help to align our local approach to international best practices. And finally, I'd like to share with you lessons that we've learned. And these lessons, our lessons could actually serve as our recommendations to those who is going to start their ethics journey. First and foremost is the approach. And to have a very successful ethics program, it is very important to get support from the senior management. It is the tone from the top is very important. And in our case, we had a very strong support of the AFC governor. And I think that was the reason why we were able to actually adopt the code and to continue the ASICS roadmap and to approve it. Secondly, with regard to developing and approval of the ASICS code, it is important to have all stakeholders buy in. So we tried to agree the ASICS code with all AFC bodies and organizations, with all members of the top management. And actually it took quite significant period of time to get the code that is accepted by everybody. But this also ensures that this code will be implemented and applied in day-to-day business. Within development and approval, another recommendation is to have a legal review of the code. We wanted the code to be enforceable, therefore we conducted a legal review, and we are now pretty sure that it also can serve as a legal document in cases of breach of our internal documents of the code. And also it is here in our second area on development and approval, it is also, we think it is also important to have a credible partner. In our case, we are partners with the Institute of Business Ethics, and the IBE helped us to review the code and gave us very insightful comments and suggestions on how to improve the code and make sure that it is aligned with best practices. And we are grateful to the Institute of Business Ethics for this work, and we are now pretty sure that our code is in a good shape. Thirdly, when implementing the ethics program, it is important to pay attention to the following matters. Firstly, it is important to have a dedicated team. We had a team in the AFC, and they actually spent a certain amount of time for developing and agreeing the code. And that is why we were able to, we've been successful in this part. Secondly, we recommend to have change agents in every organization if we're talking about the holding company. So the AFC family contains a number of AFC bodies like Astana Financial Services Authority, AFC Authority, AFC Court, International Arbitration Center, etc., etc. And we have a number of organizations. And in every organization, we identify change agents and we call them ethics ambassadors. And these ethics ambassadors are responsible for embedding the ethics program in their organizations. And also here we recommend to have reporting channels. We are working on this ourselves, but we understand that it is good to have staff responsible for it, and it is important to have reporting channel to make sure that employees can report anonymously in a confidential setting. And finally, on this slide, this is marked as the third part, but as I'll mention it as a final fourth part, with regard to raising awareness. We recommend to publish the code so that all the internal and external stakeholders are aware about that the organization is adhering to the ethical standards. And also we understand that it is important to have interactive training and communicate with internally communicate with employees about the code and discuss issues that they have related to it. Well, I hope that this will be useful to everybody who is starting their journey on implementing the ethics program. And I'll stop here and hand over to Philippa to continue on handling business ethics issues day to day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Zere, and I would just congratulate you and your colleagues in actually implementing the program, because you did it in a very, you've been through the process explaining to people, but I can tell you I have worked with many companies over the 20 years and yours did seem to be a fairly seamless implementation, even though at times it probably didn't feel like it for you. But no, I was very impressed. So now I'm going to look at some of the day-to-day issues that you might actually come across in your working lives. But I thought for just a bit of amusement, we'd start with the question, how ethical are we? Now, this is a research question that was written up in a book by Bazerman and Ten Brussel called Blind Spots, and I do recommend it as a good read. But in this online setting, I can't ask you directly, I just ask you to think about what the answers might be to this question. So for yourself, do you think you're more ethical than the average person? Now, the answer that came out is that typically 90% of people think they're more ethical than the average. But what about your colleagues? How ethical do you think they are? Well, the answer came back that most thought that their colleagues were about 66% more ethical than average. So not as ethical as yourself, but not too far behind. But actually, of course, the average is 50%, which is the normal bell curve distribution. But it's a backdrop to thinking about ethical risk, and it might assist you in actually raising your own awareness to potentially ethical issues. So first, a definition of ethical risk, and I give you a moment to read this. It's taken from the publication that was conducted by the Ethics Institute of South Africa, with whom the IBE has worked. In this definition, it rightly mentions potential practices, because it's usually these that may cause reputational harm. Sometimes they're far from obvious, but with hindsight, you might wonder why that particular action wasn't spotted. And if you reflect on the famous Volkswagen case of engineering false responses for cars being tested, you know, with hindsight, you must think, well, somebody must have known about it. Did nobody question whether that practice was right? But it's given Volkswagen a real reputational issue as that ethical risk of misconduct and misbehavior came to light, and has been a very expensive lesson for them in the numbers of billions of dollars that they've had to pay out as a consequence. So it's important to understand where ethics risk might arise. What are the day-to-day issues? Now, this is a busy looking slide, but it does represent a selection, not certainly by no means all, but a selection of the issues or topics where ethical risk can arise. And that's because judgment is needed, because either the law is not yet established, or it may be unclear, or it actually may be clear, but it's still a matter of judgment as to whether or not it's right to proceed. So let's look at some specific issues. The one I always like to start with is tax, as that is quite a debatable topic. We do know that the clear issue and the legal issue is that evading tax is illegal, full stop. But where do you actually draw the line between what is prudent tax planning for a company to avoid paying excessive tax in the payee's eyes versus possible aggressive tax avoidance, which in the authorities' eyes would equate perhaps to evasion? The spirit versus the letter of the law. So tax is an ethical issue because there is a choice as to how the organization wishes to behave. Now here I'm going to give you a personal example from many years ago now, when I was still a corporate treasurer. And it concerns the exploiting of loopholes in double taxation agreements for corporate benefit. I was chatting with a friend who was the treasurer of a building society. He was a flamboyant type and into complex transactions to earn a few extra basis points for his organization. And he came up with a scheme to set up a complex series of transactions to borrow, move monies, which he told me about with great pride. However, I actually left questioning in my own mind whether these types of transactions were right. It was designed to aggressively avoid tax. It was legal, but was it right, given the nature of the building society was a mutual body with the members all owning it? And I thought the authorities might take a view that it was actually evasion. It certainly felt to me in those days that it was very close to that line, and it's not a transaction I personally would have ever undertaken. In the end, it was actually challenged. I read about it in the press after the event and had to be unwound at great cost and some penalty. But there are a lot of other similar transactions that have been undertaken, not just by him, but by many others as well. So the ethical issue was that, was it the right thing to do? Spirit versus the letter of the law. And that just wasn't on the radar for him, but it was a useful learning exercise for me. So tax is very much an ethical issue. And in fact, in the UK, companies are now asked to produce a sort of code, a tax code, which they publish as to how their attitude towards paying tax is actually is there. So it's part of the good corporate governance reaction now. So tax is a big issue that you may come up against. Another one I just pick off that slide perhaps would be very topical today is the use of social media. There have been many instances where social media has been used, sadly, to bully colleagues, post unkind remarks, or to raise questions about behaviours in a way that you would not do face to face, but hiding behind an anonymous name. So social media and email has been used to notify people even of losing their jobs. Again, you know, stop and think, is that really the ethical thing to do? Particularly if the values of your organization might include the word respect or care. Is this really how to treat employees? But we're seeing more and more of this, particularly during these difficult times. And it's very worrying because people's mental health is being affected, and the social media companies tend not to react very quickly when asked to take down offensive material and so forth. So it's a growing problem of an ethical nature in how companies actually deal with social media. There are even companies now who are monitoring their staff's own personal interaction with social media. There's always a question, if you're doing recruitment, do you look at the potential employees' personal Facebook pages or Instagram pages, whatever it might be, just to judge the nature and the behavior or likely behaviors of that person that you're thinking of employing. Over years now, it's been quite normal to double check on whether or not somebody says that their academic credentials are correct or not, because there have been people who've lied on their CVs about this. But it's actually that whole net of what is the attitude to ethical behavior of the potential employee that is being tested now during that recruitment process. Another big issue at the moment, of course, is artificial intelligence. And again, there are many discussions about the ethics of artificial intelligence, the way it's being introduced, the way it's being used. And it certainly is giving rise to ethical issues, either through perhaps the bias or potential bias in the design of algorithms, or the lack of transparency of how that data is being used. And certainly we have seen in the UK that without good governance around the whole topic of artificial intelligence and how it's being used in a company can cause problems. Recently, the UK government was tripped up by use of algorithms in trying to identify what results of exams that students were going to have or would have had they sat them, but because of the pandemic couldn't this year. And that has led to all sorts of repercussions because the algorithms were proven to be, or perhaps they didn't have time to develop them with enough robustness to deal with the ethical issues that came as a consequence. So these are important issues, and one needs to think carefully about it. And most of these topics, the IBE has actually produced some briefing papers which you can look at on the website. And there certainly is one around business ethics and artificial intelligence with a number of questions that you might like to ask yourself if the organization you work for is involved with artificial intelligence. And it's again broadly under governance, but it's trying to understand how the system will actually work, who controls the technology, have you brought in an external group of people who perhaps don't understand your business, but they're writing the algorithms, and what is the oversight on those? And who carries the risk at the end of the day in that instance? You as a company would normally carry that risk, but how are you ensuring that you understand what that ethics risk is of subcontracting the development of AI in your business? And what might be the consequences of the use of AI? There is a lot of AI being used in the social care arena in today's environment. Many of it to great benefit to help people, elderly people, stay in their homes, being looked after, the use of AI. But it does involve monitoring, which brings me on to another subject that is a big issue, and that is all around privacy and data integrity. It is, you know, when you stop and think about how often you might have, personally, I know I have, just clicked I agree on uploading an app. You know, I appreciate that you're mostly lawyers, and I'd expect you to read all the small print, but you are also human too, and often in a hurry. So perhaps you don't always read through that language that comes up. And of course, for some companies, they're saying unless you agree, unless you click yes on all the cookies, you can't actually proceed to use their websites. But there's a question around that as to whether or not that's actually right in today's environment. Again, the use of big data. So I just wanted to give you an example there of some of the issues, just on a few of those topics that are being discussed around ethics and each of them. And we move on by just saying that there are some red flags to keep in mind, which can help you keep alert. Because if you hear one of these phrases, it might just mean that something unethical is about to happen. And when you get the slides coming through at the end, do look through this list again. I'm sure none of you have ever said these things, but it does stop and make us think about it. And one of the encouraging things, this actual list was taken from a code of ethics by a company based in the Middle East, the chemicals company. And it led them to actually then think about setting up a decision-making model to help people navigate the gray areas, which is something that the IBE is very keen on and does promote companies actually to do. So I'm going to look now at the basic ethical tests for a business decision. And these three are really quite clear: transparency, effect, and fairness. And you can see there that the sub-questions about, do I mind others knowing what I've decided, often known as the cornflakes test. If you read about what you've decided or what's happened in the newspaper tomorrow morning, I mean, just think about the Volkswagen directors reading about the test problem that they had in their newspapers, and all the other companies that have gone through issues recently. Sadly, Rio Tinto in blowing up an Aboriginal site of great sensitivity. What did they think when they were reading the newspapers the next morning? And that's where effect comes in. Who does my decision affect or hurt? And one does have to question how that Rio Tinto decision was actually made. And then finally, fairness. Would my decision be considered fair by those affected? This often comes down to process. You know, you might not agree with the decision that's actually been taken, but do you feel that you've been treated fairly in the decision that has actually been taken? And this is particularly important around personnel issues, of course. But there is a few sets of questions that you can think about, and they come up on this next slide. And it always starts, I would suggest, with values. How does this decision, or this response I've come to in making this decision, how would it align with our values? Absolutely. Sometimes the decision you're taking actually your answer will be changed by just thinking about that question. We've covered, do I mind others knowing? But what if everyone did it? It's a very good question. How can you imagine that if what you've decided to do, everybody else in the organization acted the same way? Would that be good? We've talked about the next one, but another good one is, how would that decision look in a few years' time? And that was first introduced, I came across it, by IBE'S, the British bank, who questioned and tried to think further forward. As I was saying at the outside, society's views change, and how would my decision look in a few years' time? And finally, I'm afraid, I know you are lawyers, but it is actually the last question to ask: is it legal? because too many people who are not lawyers, if that question was the first one in your decision-making model, would say, oh, I'm sure it's legal, I'm sure it's okay. And they wouldn't stop to ask themselves the other questions, which, as I say, can actually knock out or change a decision as a consequence. So is it legal really does have to come up at the very end and be the final question. So here's some pointers to help in ethics and decision making. On the next slide, just to reiterate what I've been saying about the importance of values and the importance that organizations can play through influencing behavior, through having a code of ethics, just as Zere was discussing, so that even under pressure, good decisions can be made. And again, do remember that you know, there might not be an absolutely right answer. We always put that up. It's very difficult when you've got to make a judgment between two not so happy outcomes. So I end with a reminder on that building an ethical culture is the foundation of a sustainable organization. And these four elements really pick up what I talked about originally in that framework, but also pull everything out as to how there is a train of thought through actually at the end of the day, and recognizing that doing business ethically does make for better business, which is the IBE'S strapline. So finally, thank you very much, and we look forward to questions. I hand back now to David.
Thank you very much, Philippa and Zere. Outstanding presentations. I understand that we do have a few questions that have come in. Almas, could you go ahead and read the first one?
Yes, David, thank you. So we have like combined 3 questions from Mars. Let me introduce. The question is, what were the main challenges in adopting a local approach in the AFC? Was there a role model, benchmark, which AFC could relate to or rely upon mostly? Or was it a mix of some organizations, countries, cultures when building AFC's own business ethics code? And which areas would you recommend to pay a special attention to when establishing or improving a local business ethics in a typical organization in Kazakhstan?
Well, thank you very much for this question. In fact, I will try to answer this set of questions. If I miss anything, Almas, please advise me that I missed a question. So when we developed the ethics code, we looked through a number of ethics code of other organizations from many countries, including UK, United States, Russia, European countries, etc. If your organization is going to develop the ethics code, probably it makes sense to consider organizations working in the same area as you do. For example, if you are coming from the if you are a financial company, so probably it makes sense to look at ethics codes of banks and other financial organizations. So there is an alignment in approaches. Also, as I mentioned, we heavily relied on recommendations of the Institute of Business Ethics. I would recommend to use this source. The Institute of Business Ethics, as Philippa mentioned in one of her first slides, has a number of publications with recommendations on ethics code, on ethics ambassadors, on the ethics program, etc., etc. This is actually a very concise, very clear knowledge on how to develop the ethics code, what areas should be paid attention to, and we took it as a basis. And because we are in an English common law jurisdiction, and we understand that Institute of Business Ethics is based in the UK, therefore this was a very reliable source for us to take as a basis. Almas, have I missed anything?
I don't think so. I hope you have answered to the question. If not, please, Mars, you can also forward your question again. We have a question from Bashiru Musa. He is from Lajiru, Nigeria. He is asking, what is the defining line between morals and ethics?
Fine, thank you very much indeed. It's a very interesting one. That I think I am not a well, you've heard about my career, so I'm not an ethicist. I'm not an academic in any means. And the way that the Institute has always taken this view is that morals tend to be more personal. We would say we don't go into the moral space, which is the personal view on ethical issues, but we go into the corporate space, therefore looking at codes of ethics and from the corporate point of view. So I would not wish to judge anyone's morals. I don't think that's appropriate for anybody to do. One has to try to understand people's own moral stance and where they come from and the views that they take, and show respect to that and show tolerance of that, but hopefully would have the opportunity to discuss people's moral stance. That's what debate is all about, and that does go back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. But the ethical stance that we have always focused in on is the organization's expression of ethical values and how they wish to be judged. Because by giving them out publicly and putting your ethical values up on your website, you are making a public commitment. And I don't think many companies see that one all the way through. They think, oh, it's the right thing to do, we'll put our values up. But actually that is making a public commitment as to how you're going to behave. Whereas the morals are very much a personal commitment.
Okay, Philippa, thank you very much for your answer. Next question is, how situation with COVID-19 affected to business ethics? Which sorts of business ethics are required in COVID-19 calamity across the globe?
Well, that's a big question. I think the underlying ethical issues that are really being tested, I would say would be the overarching one of fairness, respect, fairness in the sense where perhaps in various countries the furlough schemes have been operated. How do you choose which members of staff you're going to put on furlough? How do you show respect to people who are perhaps vulnerable and therefore don't actually want to return to a workplace, don't want to get on public transport, versus how do you show respect and care for those who are perhaps operating in manufacturing sites where they can't work from home. And I think companies are facing this dilemma of how to deal with staff who are sort of in different situations. And how do you, so that's one big issue. And the other big issue is, which I heard was a marvelous quote from one company, we used to have 8 offices, we now have 16,000 because everybody's working from home. And how do you manage that? So I think it's the interaction of the company and the individuals and their staff that's absolutely crucial. How do you keep that glue together of a culture?
Yeah, okay, Philippa. So I propose to have one more question, and since we are almost have 1 hour webinar, so I propose to get one. Question is, what exactly is your moral compass when deciding hard decisions?
Well, your moral compass comes back to your individual values. If you go back to the pyramid, where I said that you know, you might not have written them down, you might not actually be aware of them, but you know when they're being tested, and that is when you decide or discover where your moral compass actually lies. But it can be influenced by others, so it's deeply personal I personally have always felt that that's where the moral compass sits, but it can be influenced by others.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So we have any other questions? So I propose to send them to our email and we will be pleased to answer or forward to our distinguished speakers. David, you can just
Yes, thank
jump
you.
in.
Well, on behalf of the Academy of Law, thanks so much to Philippa and Zere for your outstanding overview of ethics, both from a global standpoint as well as from a local standpoint. I'd like to just maybe step back for a minute and look at the big picture again. Philippa and Zere really discussed a couple of different interrelated concepts. The first is ethics and values from sort of a big picture standpoint and the source of ethics. And Philippa mentioned the ancient Greeks and Roman political thinkers who commented on this very topic. And some of those philosophies really became the foundation for ethical standards that governments and political systems have used as their foundation and rationale, if you will, for the nature of their institutions. So that's sort of the theoretical side. And Zere talked about from a practical implementation standpoint as to how an ethical culture was built at the AIFC. So this topic of ethics, of course, can be an entire year-long academic program. So we can't get into all of the details around this subject now. I think it would be terrific if we could plan a follow-up, maybe a longer certificate program on this very topic. And we'll have further discussions offline about that. But let me just kind of mention, just as food for thought as we're ending today's session, let's go back to those big picture ethical principles and the source of values that ultimately, as Philippa described, become part of individual moral compasses. So what did the ancient philosophers and political thinkers say and think to provide us guidance on how to advance great civilizations? That's what we're on the verge of here in emerging markets across Central Asia, in Kazakhstan. You know, we're on the verge of a massively important advancement of a great civilization. Aristotle and Plato, the Greeks, proposed that legal systems should be based on reason and justice, that great republics should construct a framework for regulating social behaviors that are predicated on notions of goodness, truth, wisdom, and fundamental respect for the dignity of others. Now, those sound like platitudes. Those sound like ideals, but that's really what we're talking about here. This is the foundation of ultimately what becomes credible governance systems and codes of professional responsibility. In Central Asia, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the classical Roman political philosophers, because they had such a powerful influence on the regional systems of law here, including the national law of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Cicero formulated a theory of natural law based on the notion that every aspect of the universe is governed by divine reason. Now, we won't talk about religion here. Let's keep it a bit more generic. But this notion of divine reason in various permutations, shaped political thought through the ages. So the idea here is that true law means that the civil law of men must conform with natural universal principles of divine law. Thus, the state, so we make it real again, the state should uphold laws that are in harmony with these immutable laws of nature. And Cicero noted poignantly that if a state does not uphold right reason in agreement with nature, it's not truly a state. That's pretty powerful. Well, let's make it now very practical. How do we operationalize the wisdom of history's greatest political philosophers? So let's talk just for 30 more seconds on what this means for the nature and purpose of our institutions. So our political, legal, business, and educational structures can take inspiration from some of these theories of natural law or their permutations. And that says that human beings possess certain intrinsic values that govern our reasoning and behavior. Thus, perhaps our institutions should be built on these universal truths that originate from our most noble impulses. When with that, maybe our institutions should represent what's best in the human spirit. So more to come on this, but Philippa, Zara, I don't know if you have any concluding remarks for our audience, but please, we'd welcome your final comments on today's session.
Thank you, David. If I might go first, I think I would leave the thought as a guiding sort of thought really for how to behave is the golden rule. It's applicable to people of faith, of no faith, to all people. And that is treating others as you would like to be treated, and never losing sight of that actually when you're doing business with others, you want to do it for mutual benefit, not for one side to get a better of the other. So mutual benefit, treating others as you would like to be treated, I think are fairly good maxims to hold on to for actually doing business in this world today.
Great, thank you. Zere, do you have any closing remarks for our audience today?
Well, I wouldn't be able to put it in a better way than Philippa did. I would just only mention what we already discussed with Institute of Business Ethics before, that legal documents do not always give answers on how to behave. And it's very important that companies understand that also it's not only legal side that is important. Well, legal is important, but also we need to think about areas that are not black and white. So, and this is where the ethics plays a very crucial role. I would recommend to use this in practice and consider whether your organizations are need to have the ethics program and ethics code. This is as a practical advice. And I thank David for this opportunity, and I thank you very much, Philippa, for supporting this initiative today. Thank you.
It's our pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you, David.
And to our audience, we hope to see you soon. Stay tuned. This is one of our favorite subjects, so there will be more to come. Thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.